On that note, good morning, everyone. My name is Stanisław Pieczak, not Marek Matraszek. Marek couldn't be here today. I'm here in his stead. He's very sorry, and he says hello to you all. I am the Director of Intelligence at the CEC Group, but the intelligence will be in these chairs today, and definitely not here. Let me introduce the panel. Going from the furthest is Dr. Marcin Walecki, the Director to the European and previously head of the Democratization Department for the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. Dr. Walecki has over 25 years' experience in supporting democracies on anti-corruption, political finance, and political party assistance. Next to him is Jan Surotczak, the Senior Director for Transatlantic Strategy at the International Republican Institute, with over 2 decades of experience in Central Eastern Europe, and he leads the Institute's relationship with political parties in the EU, focusing on building transatlantic ties with democratic communities here. Dr. Teresa Nowotna, the Senior Associate Research Fellow at the European Institute for European Policy, and a Marii Skłodowska-Curie Fellow at the Free University in Berlin. Dr. Nowotna has published on EU enlargement and has practical experience from the European Commission, the EU delegation in Washington, and the Czech Perm Rep. And last but not least, Professor Alex Szczerbiak, Professor of Politics at the University of Sussex, a renowned expert in political party dynamics, frequent commentator on Polish, CE, and EU events, who also publishes a research blog analysis of the Polish political scene, which I highly recommend, Polish Politics blog, wordpress.com. And interestingly, this is Professor Szczerbiak's second appearance at the Congress, his last being at the first Congress in 2004. So welcome again. We like our repeat speakers. Heading straight into the V4, I think we're going to cover the first 20 minutes specifically about the V4, but then move to the issue of Russia, Ukraine, and the regional cooperation that the CE region has to play in that. But a few short words of introduction on the V4. I think I chaired a panel 5 years ago at Warwick Congress with the exact same question. Union without a union, generally student audiences in the UK are very excited about the V4 and the capabilities that gives for meeting fellow students from the region and actually traveling there and having and establishing their political opinions and cultural opinions as the V4 region. The V4 will celebrate its 31st birthday in, I think, 10 days. I think this is the 15th of February. But throughout the years, the V4 has shown its ability to cooperate efficiently, serving as a support platform for EU accession, NATO accession, coming together for issues big and small, for stronger negotiating positions in Brussels on separate directives, but also on big political issues. The V4 is a great platform for grander alliances, the V4 Plus formats of inviting not only other Western partners but other organizations. But it has also been called in recent years the bad boys of Europe. There have been conflicts, and recently there is talk of a V4 split, the famous V2 plus 2. The Slovak Prime Minister Edward Heger took power last year, kind of cementing a break with Hungary and Poland, and recently he was joined by the new Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala, with even a quote from Slovak and Czech officials saying now the odds have changed to 2 against 2. And to talk about that, whether the V4 can cooperate strongly together and what it has achieved, what it can achieve, is what we'll do here today. My first question will be directed to Dr. Walecki on how the history of the V4 has changed. What are the goals that the V4 set out with 30 years ago, and where has it got to now? Is it still the same perspective?
Well, let me start by, first of all, thank you very much indeed for your invitation. Lovely to be on the panel with old friends. Moderator told us to be short and sharp. This is the panel before lunch, so let's just try to keep it very interactive. I fully agree with the statements made in this video remarks, introductory remarks. 30 years, 31st anniversary, I think it's, a success story. Definitely, if you look historically, I would argue, I'm not Norman Davies, but I would argue that if you look at the 20th century, we never had an easy cooperation in the region, So even, during the Soviet times, collaboration in the region was difficult. I think the last 30 years show that we can have successful, constructive collaboration. You know, you mentioned Visegrád Fund, thousands of scholarships, projects, joint projects. In terms of challenges, you know, what I think we are missing from the original historical declaration, indeed Visegrád Declaration 1991, just wanted to quote 3 out of 5 major objectives, and I would ask everyone in the room to ask themselves if those are still the objectives for the group. So the first objective, full restitution of democracy and freedom. Objective number 2, construction of parliamentary democracy, a modern state of law, respect for human rights and freedoms. Objective number 5, full involvement in the European political and economic systems. And I would argue, if you look at the priorities of the recent presidencies and the current presidency, I don't see those historical objectives as being the main objectives. One could argue times have changed, that we had to focus on those issues because of the NATO and EU accession. I would argue that those objectives of 91, I don't think they were just there because of the NATO and EU membership. They were truly principles which were driving our founding fathers in early 90s, because they knew that those are key objectives to make sure that countries are successful members of EU and successful and respected members of European family.
So is it that now that the V4 countries have joined NATO and the EU, it's just another diplomatic format as all the others, no?
We need those diplomatic formats. I can tell you, as a former diplomat working for OSCE, I found my meetings in Prague, Bratislava and Budapest being the most constructive one. And as a Pole, I could have a very frank and open discussions with my Hungarian colleagues. And working for Office of OSCE, ODIHR, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, I had to visit Budapest quite a lot of times over the last few years. Prague and Bratislava were very, very strong supporters to democracy promotion and democracy assistance. So, you need regional forums like this one. You have Nordic states collaborating in the same format, and their collaboration is effective. So definitely from diplomatic perspective, it is a very useful platform which allows diplomats to exchange views and discuss sensitive issues, and then present the common policies to the extent possible in Brussels and other international forums, UN, Council of Europe, OSCE. But I'm sure that we will go back to this discussion. However, I do see challenges. And indeed, geopolitical struggles. Ukraine is one of the major challenges which V4 would be facing in the next few months.
But I wanted to go back to the sensitive issues that diplomats are facing and go to Dr. Novotná with how sensitive issues have been faced in the recent dispute between Czechia and Poland on Turów mine, whether that dispute actually drove a wedge, and whether you see the so-called sloganistic 2+2 breakaway of Czechia, Slovakia from Poland, Ukraine, and perhaps looking more to Germany and Austria instead of Poland and Hungary, sorry. Is that bridge likely to be rebuilt in the coming years, or is the Czech government firmly stepping away from the format?
Right. So first of all, thank you also very much for having me here. It's my great pleasure to be here. Also, it's my first post-Brexit trip to the UK, so it was very strange for me to actually show my passport. But everything went very smoothly, so very good experience. So actually, this also shows that even with countries where, even those which they split from the European Union, you can
still remain part of it.
Yes. But going back to your question, the agreement about the Turów mine created a bit of an uproar domestically in the Czech Republic. On one hand, of course, everyone is quite happy that the conflict has been, settled, and I'm personally happy that that there's no probably no legal proceedings going to take place. On the other hand, the Czech government, which is in place quite shortly, and argued that it's a government of a big change and of transparency, came to the agreement in overnight session of the government, which wasn't even on the agenda of the session, that the agreement would be discussed. And the Czech government even haven't published the agreement yet, despite lots of journalists and, of course, the populations in the region asking to actually see what has been agreed upon. So I don't want to go into the substance of the agreement, but it's kind of interesting that something which should be sort of an achievement in bilateral relations, V4 relations, is now seen as more like, well, there's no change, you know, it's the same old sort of behind the closed door deals. So let's wait once we actually see what's in there. Impact on relations with Poland and V4. On the other hand, you know, especially the Minister for European Affairs has been quite critical of Hungary and of Poland, and saying, you know, we will, as the new government, look for new partners more in the West. We will also see how it plays out in terms of the Czech EU presidency, which is coming up from July on this year. There seems to be quite strong cooperation with France, especially, not just because current presidency is in the hands of France, but also because of the issue of nuclear power, which unites France and the Czech Republic. So I want to say, I don't want to, you know, pass a strict judgment, but I would say that probably V4 under the current government will not function as much as it did before. And also because of the Czech Republic taking over the EU presidency, it will have a little bit different dynamism.
The dynamics for Czechia and Slovakia are to their benefit, as they like to think. But Poland and Hungary are left feeling a bit lonely, right? Through it all. And I wanted to direct the next question to Professor Szczerbiak about how Poland is feeling, who has, I think, historically liked to present itself or think of itself as the leader of the V4, the uncalled ad hoc leader, and trying to be the big boy of the V4 club and also play it in other relationships in the West. Could you tell us a little bit about the Polish attitude to the V4, whether it is not too paternalistic, perhaps, and how Poland and the region are going to be weakened by this split that is occurring currently?
Sure, yeah, and before I do, I'd also, like the other speakers, like to thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this wonderful event, and hopefully it won't be 18 years before it's the next time I have to speak at another one. So, I think the thing about Poland's relationship with the V4, the really important thing to bear in mind here is that it's somewhat different. The current government's approach to this is somewhat different from its predecessors. And to understand that, I think you have to understand the current Polish government's strategy towards advancing its interests, Poland's interests within the EU. And the current government it's been very critical of its predecessors, whose strategy you can sum up as basically trying to advance Poland's interests by locating Poland within what you might call the European mainstream, and in particular building links with the major European powers, the Franco-German axis, and in particular with Berlin and Germany. And the current government was elected in 2015, arguing that rather than trying to work through the mainstream, Poland had to develop its own stream. Okay, this is własny nurt and not główny nurt, as I think Andrzej Duda put it in 2015. And the Visegrád 4 is a critical element in this. It's one of a number of alternative alliances that the current government is trying to build within the EU to create kind of alternative voting blocks of interests. The V4 is an absolutely critical one. It's probably the most important one, but there's other things like the 3Cs initiative, which involves a wider number of post-communist states. At one point, it was the alliance with the UK, who was seen as Poland's, originally until Brexit, Poland's kind of key strategic partner within the European Union. But obviously not now, although the relationships are very close. So that's, I think, the view that the current Polish government has of how it would like to the V4 to operate as the potential for a kind of one part of an alternative power bloc. So if you like, not an alternative to the EU, but an alternative to the EU political establishment. But there are, of course, all kinds of problems with this, problems about, whether other countries want to be members of an organization where Poland is, the main player, a regional power, problems about getting this group of countries to agree on issues, because it's a very diverse group, and there's lots of issues it's very difficult to get them to agree about. And, to return to your question, problems about whether they are actually interested in a project or using the V4 as a project to have an alternative to the EU political establishment. Hungary maybe, yes, but the Czech Republic and Slovakia, particularly since the two new governments came to office there, much less so. They're much less enthusiastic about the idea of using the V4 rather than as being a regional cooperation platform, as some kind of geopolitical instrument to reconfigure power within the European Union. They're much more interested in trying to work within the European mainstream.
In terms of geopolitical power, I think what has been built by the V4 isn't going to be disestablished as easily. I'm here especially curious about the U.S. perspective on the V4 and how the U.S., whether the U.S., as I think, is actually the best aspect that the V4 has built a relationship with, to be being seen as the core actor here for the U.S. to be able to branch out and deal with other regional matters via the V4, perhaps the Baltic, the Three Seas initiative. And this is my question to you, Jan Turacek, whether the view from the U.S. is optimistic about the V4 throughout the years and in the future.
Thanks. Let me also just say thank you to the organizers. Dziękuję bardzo. Much appreciated. Glad to be here. Let me, if I can, by way of answering the question, just do a tiny little bit of history, right? I think it's worth remembering that when you look at the V4 from the outside, particularly from as far away as Washington, these four countries do, in many respects, have much more in common with each other than even you all sometimes think you do, right? Whether it's historically, culturally, religiously, linguistically, with the exception of Hungary, with regard to the empires that the current territories were once part of, and certainly with regard to the time of the founding, Marcin, right? Let's remember that in those days, Czechoslovakia was still very much a concept, right, as one state. I think both internally and externally, the four countries of Visegrád were looked at as having had very similar political histories during the course of the communist era, right? Revolutions in 56 and 68 and constantly in Poland, right? All delivering sort of stars in the American mind of the rebirth of freedom, whether it was Wałęsa or Havel or you name it, right? So I think from the American perspective, it has been easy to view the four together. They're all very close to each other geographically for us.
The accents sound the same when you're in the U.S.?
Well, with the exception of Hungary, right? But it's obviously been complicated over the years, but it has always been complicated, right? Let's remember the point at which the Hungarian government decided to issue passports to Hungarians living abroad, for example, on the territory of Slovakia, right? The relationship between Slovakia, the bilateral relationship between Slovakia and Hungary was not particularly rosy in those days either, but we all know that over the course of 31 years, governments come and governments go. And I think, if you look at it from that perspective, the core interests that tend to put the four countries together really do remain. Bratislava will always have or be tempted to have a special relationship with Austria because it's there and because economically it's crucially important. It will always have to have some sort of a different relationship with Hungary because of the minorities, the ethnic minorities that we deal with. But from the American perspective, we go back to the integration into NATO, the integration into the EU, and really these four, once Mečiar was taken care of in Slovakia, which was in some significant part also due to the pressure collectively from Visegrád, in addition to pressure from NATO and the EU. I think there will continue to be a tendency in DC to view them together and to look at how they can work together, with Poland obviously in a special position just because of size, right? And because of the bilateral relationship that we will, I suspect, for my lifetime have with Poland. But each of the four brings a different aspect to the relationship, and I think it's worth noting that just 2 days ago, the Slovak foreign minister and the Slovak defense minister were in Washington signing a new defense agreement with the United States, right? And I see those kinds of things continue across Visegrád with us, and our tendency will be to try to treat it as a group.
You mentioned the core interests of the Visegrád group, and I want to treat that as a segue into a general discussion on other forms of regional cooperation and regional cooperation vis-a-vis what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. So the buildup of Russian troops on Ukraine's borders and on Belarus's borders is certainly worrying and is prompting new regional cooperation. There is the format of the newly established format of Poland, the UK, and Ukraine. There is a format of France, Germany, and Ukraine. There is the US, of course, involved on many fronts. And it's starting to seem like the West is fractured. Like Putin is playing off on all of these formats, which aren't going to come together, but are going to be separate. And I wanted to ask Dr. Walecki about whether these regional cooperation formats in relation to Ukraine are not counterproductive, even.
Yeah, very good question. If I can just go back for a second to what Jan mentioned, and it's very important historical thing to remember. And this is my personal opinion, but Visegrád Group historically showed that there is a mechanism to remind ourselves what are the key principles. What happened with Mečar is one very good example of how V4 could show the leadership. And I'm asking myself, and I think everyone in this room should ask themselves, what if 3rd of April elections in Hungary are not credible? If we have a problem with elections which are not meeting international standards, should V4 be the first regional organization to do exactly what they did with Mečar, which might be difficult because we have a Hungarian presidency. But those are the moments, historical moments, where a group needs to speak with one voice, as they did in the case of Mečar. So let's hope that elections in Hungary in April are going to meet all the international standards, because if they don't, then we have a huge problem for the region, for Europe, and for the whole Western world. So regional forums are important. Going back to Ukraine, I think again we are in a very important moment where we have chairmanship of OSCE. Poland has a chairmanship of OSCE. It's a huge privilege, but also an obligation. And I really believe that this is going to be the major format for resolving tensions in Ukraine. And those tensions in Ukraine, in my lifetime, short but still, I've been working on those issues. I've been working in Ukraine since '99. I spent 6 years in Ukraine. I speak Ukrainian. I can tell you that this is probably one of the darkest moments for whole our region, and I'm not exaggerating. It's still 50-50, 50% of chance that Russia might attack Ukraine. What we are seeing in terms of intelligence, it's probably one of the largest concentrations of arms. And I have to tell you that most of the international organizations were surprised in 2014, when we should learn from our failures of 2014. And just, to provoke you again, because I think we're here to think, is imagine if there is a conflict of Ukraine, which countries, which region is going to be affected the most with refugees? We spoke briefly about different scenarios. I agree, we're talking about few million refugees who can potentially leave from Ukraine to Poland. Jan believes Slovakia might not be the destination for different reasons, but definitely for Poland. And as we have leading European political leaders meeting in Kiev, one political leader at the same time is drinking champagne in Moscow. How does it speak for unified position of the Visegrád Group?
Is there actually a chance of this bubbling up and causing, I don't want to say a telling off, but a formal split? We're speaking about the possibility of war in Europe. The conflict in Ukraine, of course, is ongoing, but the escalation and the effect that will have on the V4 economies, and this is, I think, an open question to all of you, is when will be the red line crossed for the region standing apart instead of standing together? Takers. Sorry, Dr. Walecki said we're here to think, so I try to provoke.
I'll try. In several ways, I guess you could argue that the red line has already been crossed, right? Let's remember that this isn't the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? Exactly. This has long since happened, right? Let's go back to 2014. I'd just like to get that terminology right, because we very often get it wrong when we're talking about this, certainly in the public media.
Conflict,
right? Yeah. I think the message, Marcin, that was sent by that glass of champagne in Moscow the other day, when we are so desperately working collectively to come up with a common approach that says something different, points out the real fundamental danger that we're in right now. In my opinion, Hungary on both Russia and China has long since made a decision about where it believes the future is, at least under the current government. Marcin and I were talking before this. Go back to Viktor Orban's speech in Romania in the summer of 2014, actually, just at the same time things were going on, now that I think about it, where he lays out his frustrations with Western liberal democracy and lays out the idea that Russia and China have a preferable system, a more long-term, stable system capable of providing economic prosperity to their people than the West has offered him. Right? So none of this should be new to anybody, which is the disturbing thing, right? From our perspective, an added layer of complication was added by his decision to be the main host for the 17+1 framework with Beijing, right? And we have had many very frank and open discussions with our Hungarian colleagues in Fidesz, with whom we have worked for 35 years about these issues. But I think they have made, in many ways, a very fundamentally different geostrategic assessment and decision than the other countries in the Visegrád group have made for now, right? But I want to come back to my point earlier. Governments in Visegrád come and go, right? We don't know what's going to happen on April 3rd in Hungary. Marcin, I share your concerns about the election, but, this government will not be there forever. And if the opposition were to win in Hungary on April 3rd, it has made very clear that it will reorient the country toward the EU, toward NATO, and I think instinctively to Visegrád.
And then Poland.
Correct.
So I wanted to move, because Poland is currently desperately needs Hungary. It needs Hungary in the European Commission for the veto, so Poland is kind of the actor that allows Hungary to do so. Do you see that changing, or?
Well, I mean, first of all, obviously it's a very dangerous situation for Poland, what's going on in Ukraine and potentially on its eastern border, and so, it's bad news, obviously, that situation for the Polish government. However, I mean, within that, there are certain opportunities, I think, for the Polish government as well as threats. I mean, one of them is the opportunity to carve out a role for itself as a regional leader, which it's doing. It's an opportunity to build even stronger ties with the Ukrainian government. I mean, during the previous conflict, Poland was somewhat sidelined. Towards the end of that, it was the format that was developed put Poland on the sidelines, and at the moment, because it's at the forefront of defending Ukraine and even offering to send arms to Ukraine, that's a great opportunity. There's opportunities about building a closer relationship with the Biden administration, which has been very problematic, to say the least, here, because of the role that Poland is playing, not to mention with the UK and things like that. So there are all kinds of opportunities. Within the Visegrád group, there's an opportunity to actually get stronger relations with the Czechs, which have been problematic since the change of government. We were talking about the 2+2, but actually on this particular issue, Poland and the new Czech government are kind of on the same page. So, going against the problematic stuff. The problem is obviously with Hungary, which Poland has as a key ally. It's been an on and off problem, I think, for the Polish government. Or for Law and Justice, even when it was in opposition, that it built this key alliance. I think the way that it has tried to finesse this is really by kind of being, while saying that obviously they don't agree with the pivot towards Moscow and Putin that Budapest has been doing, it's kind of understandable in the sense of trying to give itself geopolitical options. And the other argument that it will use is that a lot of the people condemning it for its apparent closeness to Moscow are people that in reality have built very, very close economic, diplomatic relations with Moscow through things like the Nord Stream 2 project, which the current Polish government says is actually, you know, the biggest, putting the situation in Ukraine aside, the biggest geopolitical blunder that Western Europe can make, and the biggest opportunity for Moscow. And these are governments that, you know, have criticised and will criticise Budapest for its relations. So it's a tricky issue, obviously, for the Polish government, because it's its key ally, both within the V4 and within the EU, and it simply has a different view and disagrees with it. But there are arguments that it uses to try and finesse that, and in particular to accuse the Western powers and its critics of hypocrisy, given the fact that they've, on occasions, have been very open about developing relations with Moscow, and at the moment are very cautious about, for example, making the case for further sanctions, which they've been heavily criticised for, even by people who are their normal allies within Poland, in the kind of the liberal left, that would normally say Poland should work very, very closely with France and Germany, but have been very, very critical of them in terms of their approach to the Ukrainian crisis.
I wanted to touch, you mentioned Nord Stream 2, and the new Czech and Slovak governments are trying to have a different relationship with Germany. And Poland has been hammering on Nord Stream 2 as the biggest danger, especially in the relation to the Ukraine crisis, where there is calls to quickly and rapidly use that as a tool. But Germany is, of course, not committing to anything. Will the Czechs and Slovaks kind of be able to join, you think, Poland and Hungary if matters escalate instead of trying to get closer to Germany?
Specifically on Nord Stream 2, well, the Czech government is quite keen on now to push to change let's put it this way. The Czech government is quite happy with the changes in Brussels when it comes to the taxonomy on energy, including nuclear power and gas. And that's affecting a bit of also the Czech views on the Nord Stream. So, of course, the Czech government is at the moment more critical than the previous one on Nord Stream, but at the same time, because of these issues, it is still sort of sticking, or sort of hiding itself behind the German position on this. And I wouldn't expect that this is going to change too much, in a sense that, you would probably like the Czechs to sort of be much more prominent on criticizing the Nord Stream. I mean, we touch upon Germany. I've been living there now for 3 years. So it's interesting to see the German views of Visegrád 4.
That was my follow-up. Yes,
okay, good. To some extent, I think it's much less of a sort of grouping that Germany sees as a full group, in the sense that Germany is much keener on sort of doing the bilateral relations. It was the position of the previous government, and I think the current one is sort of continuing in this as well. Before coming to Germany, I actually spent about 5-6 years in Brussels, and there I would say Visegrád Group as a whole is not a very good brand.
Is not
a very good brand, and it's a bit of a shame because actually there's been quite a lot of Visegrád Group activities going on in Brussels on a lower level, so not the high political agreements, but representations of think tanks, Visegrád Group, Visegrád funding, lots of events about Central and Eastern Europe. So actually, Visegrád kind of helped to raise the profile of all the V4 countries. But unfortunately, when it comes to the high-level politics, it is definitely, not something you want to really wave the flag with.
But on working level, working level diplomats are very happy because the Visegrád gives the ability to actually meet and form common positions. And we sometimes take a step back to criticize the big politics, not realizing that underneath there is a myriad of positions towards specific directives, specific regulations, transport. I was talking about that yesterday. That it's not in the news sometimes. What actually the Visegrád cooperation can achieve because it's happening on a day-to-day basis, really. I think we've got, I'm not sure on the timing, we started a bit later, but I could open the floor to questions, if there are any, and yes? Of course, the questions can be general or addressed to specific.
Hi, well, my name is Miłosz. I've got a question that's sparked by what Professor Sherbik was saying, but I guess it could be open to anyone on the panel, about the nature and the conflict, about building Vlastne and Główny Nurt, about building different alliances within an alliance. So I guess you may have a general view about that notion of building alliances within an alliance, but I guess specifically about the role of V4 as an alliance within an alliance. So I wonder whether you've got any advice for Poland, I guess, on what's a reasonable stance to take on approaching this V4 group. What should Poland be doing? I guess if you want, you can think of it as if Mr. Kaczynski, Morawiecki, or Duda came to you and say, I don't think we're getting this V4 thing right. What do you think we should do? I wonder what you would tell them.
Back to being a political consultant.
Yeah, I think that's probably a question that people who are experts in the other countries should really answer. I'm sorry, that's a bit of a cop-out because, that's because it's very clear what the Polish government's trying to achieve. And the obstacle, they would say, lies in the politics of different countries and how they respond to it. I mean, I think basically, I think what the Polish government would say is that, look, if you're trying to do something ambitious, okay, if you're trying to develop an alternative power bloc to the dominant power bloc within the EU, okay, you're trying to get people to kind of completely, reorientate themselves. I mean, most communist states, their default position has been identify within the European mainstream and get as close as you possibly can to Germany. I mean, you sort of said this, and that's the absolute default. It's an uphill struggle, okay? It's very, very difficult. Now, if you want to get, to go down very well in Brussels and get, as the Polish government would say, Tania Oklaski or something, a cheap round of applause, you basically do that. Okay, the road that they've chosen to go down is a much, much harder road. Okay, and it's about realigning the natural alignments of a lot of different countries, and that's a long-term investment, I think, on their part. So, I mean, I guess if you simply want to get the praise of Brussels, to be very closely welcomed, to get back in with the EU political establishment, then don't try and do that. Go a different way. If, however, you want to try and build an alternative power bloc, you've got to be ready for the fact that it's going to, meet against the natural inclinations of a lot of these countries. I think that's the problem. So it's really what, the advice is what you're trying to achieve. Okay, are you trying to get back in the good books of the major powers, the political establishment and Brussels, in which case that's easy, or are you trying to develop an alternative power bloc? That's hard and maybe impossible, but the current government would say, but worth trying, because at the end of the day, what do you achieve by just being part of the European mainstream?
Follow-up?
Yeah, just to build on what Alex said, and again, my personal views, two recommendations I would make is, first of all, really allow professional diplomats to do their job. Do not, sacrifice foreign affairs for domestic audience, for domestic purposes. There are so many formats in which Poland could play a more active role, and it's trying. We have really professional diplomats who are doing their best. You have an Eastern Partnership, where Poland and Sweden were actually the leading, as the leading forces. You have now chairmanship of OSCE. You had Poland on Security Council of UN. I mean, all those platforms are important. You should not just focus on one and try to create alternative one. You need to recognize that there are different formats, and you have to probably take, leadership positions, especially if you are positioned, and Poland is in the region. So I would say V4, but let's not forget about Eastern Partnership. Let's not forget about OSCE. Going back to V4, and going back to Ukraine, I would even argue that it would be in our strategic interest to see down the road, in a few years' time, Ukraine as a part of the V4. And this would be the sign of solidarity with Ukraine, which is right now our closest and most important neighbor. And we need to show the signs of solidarity. And so V4 should play a very important role in terms of supporting Ukraine. But the second advice I would have, maybe slightly going away from a big politics, is focusing on education. If you look at the statistics, if you look at the average age of teachers in V4 countries, average age is over 50. We are going to have a huge crisis in education in V4 countries in the next 10 years. If you look at the level of universities, my network, Europeum, is representing 18 leading European universities. 2 of them are in V4. I strongly disagreed with what happened with Central European University in Budapest. It was a huge mistake. You know, we had a very powerful university in V4. You know, we need to invest in education. This is our competitive advantage. If we want to be competitive in Europe, globally, education is the most important thing. And there are programs within the Visegrád Fund, but they are not sufficient. We really need to prioritize education as one of the competitive advantages which our region should have. So that would be my second recommendation.
Questions?
Thank you for your great discussion. I have a question regarding the V4 and the April Hungary election. I feel that the V4 is taken as a PR tool by Polish government and Hungarian government, but with the current opposition from the Czech and Slovak government, what do you think? How will Viktor Orban take the V4 to actually assert their power, assert the power in spite of the opposition from the EU?
I think we touched on that a little bit, but we can...
I'll just do a little addendum if I can. I don't know if this is going to be a sufficiently direct answer to your question, but it's something that's been sort of going over in my mind as we've been sitting here talking. So I work for a political party institute, right? So weirdly, over the past, I would say, 5 to 10 years, from my perspective, one of the most interesting lines of discourse inside the Visegrád 4 is among political parties, and particularly in specific regard to Fidesz and PiS, right? And its effort to do exactly what the professor is talking about, which is sort of build an alternative approach to the way the European Union is currently constructed. And for me, the most fascinating piece inside of that is the fact that it hasn't really worked all that well. Mm-hmm. I mean, clearly, Orban Viktor needs, going into his election on April 3rd, some degree of international acceptance and approval that would be demonstrated through these kinds of political alliances. But he really has not been able to build that in the way that I know that he wanted to build. And in part because, I would argue, folks back in Law and Justice in Poland have decided that they don't want to do it exactly the way Viktor Orban wants to do it, which I think is a fascinating little subset of what's going on.
They've cheated many times.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and used.
And used, exactly right. So, you know, when you talk to parties around the rest of Europe, we were just in Rome before Christmas for a meeting with Matteo Salvini. And they very much look at what's going on here as what they call Viktor's project, right? Not a Polish project, but a Hungarian project, right? And I think it's worth like just taking a look at how that has played out and what has worked and what has not worked in the bilateral political relationship here.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting comment because, I mean, I'm not a Hungarian specialist. I mean, some people say I'm not a Polish specialist either, but I mean, because actually my perception of it, and I'll take what you say and I reflect on it, was really rather different. And what you said actually gives me pause for thought, which is that Viktor Orban's project is primarily a Hungarian project. You know, he's aimed at sort of domestic politics, whereas it's Law and Justice that's trying to paint on a much larger canvas, and you know, it's to do with the size of the country, but also to do with the kind of the ambitions. So things like trying to develop links with other European parties, the Warsaw Summit, these kind of events. I mean, the European Conservative and Reformist Group within the European Parliament, which is essentially now a Law and Justice-led group since the British Conservatives have left. I mean, these are all kinds of elements of trying to go beyond simply configuring a project that works at the domestic level. Whereas, you know, I mean, I think, you know, and I also think, and this was my assumption, that this fitted in with the kind of the pivots and the flirtations with different regional powers, with Moscow, for example. I mean, if you're trying to reconfigure and build a project as a regional player within the EU and an alternative bloc, it's kind of difficult to do that if you can immediately be dismissed as you know, having too close links with Putin. It's one of the Achilles heels, I think, of a lot of the things that Law and Justice has been trying to do, and why it's kind of constantly on the back foot when it tries to build links with
Pretending it doesn't, it's not
with,
happening.
with Eurosceptic parties, or criticising other parties for, you know, whataboutery and saying, yeah, but what about your links? So, I mean, I think that's interesting because, you know, my view was always that Orban is primarily focused on domestic politics and doesn't have a larger European project. Well, there's a key difference. Law and Justice does. You know, what it's trying to do is locate it within a bigger and much more ambitious project, which, as you say, is you know, probably not working very well at the moment, but realistically, it's not going to work very well in the short term. It's a long game that they're in for, I think.
Just to build on what Alex said very briefly, he's too modest. He's one of the well-published and most established experts on party politics in Poland. So, but you know, both of you described something which I've seen over the last 2 years. It's a party diplomacy. Traditional forms of diplomacy has been slowly replaced in V4 by party diplomacy. And when I spoke with the senior politicians from Austria, they said we are seeing, and we've already seen 2 years ago, an establishment of a new party family, conservative family in Europe, if it was not for the disagreements about Russia. So we are actually seeing Viktor's project. Probably, you know, peace also has, you know, its own interest in this game, but we are seeing a formulation of a new party family in Europe, and, you know, with an important role played by Salvini. Austrians are going to be part of it. Maybe you guys are not aware of it, but yesterday Le Pen got a 10 million euros loan from a Hungarian bank to help her with the upcoming presidential campaign. So we are actually seeing a new, very powerful family of conservative forces coming to be a major players.
And just a sort of a Czech comment to that. What's interesting is that the Czech government is currently consisting of two big coalitions, out of which one coalition is made of 3 parties, and the prime minister is from the Civic Democrats, which is also a member of the ECR group together with PiS, which, given the question you asked me at the beginning about the agreement about Turov mine, people are thinking, well, maybe there was some kind of a party deal between PiS and ODS, Fiala's party, to actually come to the conclusion because they are actually part of the same European group. But what's interesting for the Czech government is that it portrays itself as much more pro-European, as as different to the previous government on especially European issues. But yet you have the prime minister from probably the most Eurosceptic group within the European Parliament, and the prime minister who left and is leading the opposition, Babiš, and who is going to run for the Czech presidency most likely, is in the Renew group, which is probably the most liberal group in the European Parliament. So if there is going to be some kind of a realignment in terms of, you know, the Polish and Hungarian parties, but also possibly the Czech parties as well, it's a big question whether Prime Minister Fiala would bring his party back to the EPP. But if there is some kind of a big reshuffle, then I wouldn't say that it's not impossible, because those who are most Eurosceptic within his party, they've been sort of pushed in the back, and they don't have currently any important positions in the government, and if they are anywhere, they are mostly in the European Parliament.
Jan, quick follow-up?
Super short. What this all says to me, though, as we look at it from outside, is that it is impossible to do this realignment of party groups at the EU level without parties from Visegrád, right? They are crucially important to the entire process of restructuring.
The follow-up, you said about the possible reorganization of a new conservative movement in Europe, and I don't know if you noticed when they were at the Vox summit, and they published takeaways, and Poland in their statement had that they agreed on condemning the Russian situation in Ukraine, and then Marine Le Pen took it out from her statement. It was missing. There was a sentence missing. So obviously this is the variable that is keeping them from agreeing. We have time, I think, for one last question, if there is any. We started a bit late, so sorry for keeping you from lunch.
I have a very short question coming back to what Dr. Walecki said about Eastern Partnership. Considering the current situation in Ukraine, how would you see the future role Eastern Partnership would have to play?
We could have a whole panel on Eastern Partnership. I definitely see problematic things with Belarus currently, with Azerbaijan and Armenia. But I think, as I said earlier, I mean, it is our obligation towards Ukraine to show them 100% of solidarity and support Ukraine. I mean, what is happening in Ukraine now is going to be decisive for the future of Europe.
And with that sweet and short answer, I think we can thank all the panelists for this morning. And we hope to see you again in a few years' time about a discussion about a possibly whole different union than the Visegrád group.
So we would like to thank our distinguished speakers and welcome someone who's going to speak about the Go for Poland program. Thank you.
Thank you.